And that brings us to our discussion agenda. So on 16 under our agenda, we are discussing an update on the Chapin High School Stadium project.
Madam Chairman, board members, members of the community, thank you for your time. I want to give you just a follow-up to our last meeting where we talked about doing a phasing of the Chapin High School project. We got a little bit more detail and a little bit better timeline that we just wanted to advise you on. As we said, we looked at the stadium. As you know, it was coming in about $2.5 million over budget. So we looked at trying to complete as much as we could with the funding that you provided for us. We broke it up into 3 phases. That's just kind of I hope you can see that as well as I can. But the 4 phases are, of course, the visitor side stadium first, the press box, the field house, and the locker rooms, and then the concession stands in that order. So, not a good a graphic, but bleachers were not very exciting to get a picture of. But the first part of the project will be to bring Chapin High School up to the South Carolina High School League requirements of at least 5,000 seats, so that we can be involved in playoffs. Phase 2 would be the completion and the renovation of the press box, to include some of the sound systems, the restrooms, and the concession stand. As we talked last time, looking at phasing it, we would leave the concession stand and the restrooms, but do some remodeling in there to allow them to still be able to be used while we complete the other parts of the project. So that's just a rough floor plan that they put together for us. It would look very similar to that. Phase 3 would be tackling some of the HVAC systems up in the upper locker room up there by the track and doing some additional shower and office renovation inside the field house. And 4 would be the final portion of this, would be up on top of the hill to the right of the scoreboard as you're looking downfield, would to build the concession stand and a promenade and some additional seating in the end zone by the scoreboard. One of the recommendations that we've looked at, we had a meeting Thursday and Friday with the architect and the engineer. Thursday we got a timeline of having to complete schematics to the engineer by this Friday so they can go ahead and start working on the price points and having a guaranteed maximum price list to you by the 23rd of January. One of the things we looked at, and Ms. Hines, you talked about keeping the prices as close as we can. That will allow us to keep the prices as close as we can by go ahead and ordering some of the long-term items that have a long turnaround time to get back to us. We talked about waiting until after the football season to start on the press box. This will allow them to go ahead and complete all their seasons. The visitor side seating would be in place before football season starts, holding off until November. Talked to Mr. Ames at the school on Friday. He's in agreement with considering that as the option and holding off until at least November to start the press box area. And that way we will have all the parts on order. That would be a delay if we tried to start it anytime sooner. So that'll put us pretty much on track to have everything completed as far as the stadium seating on the visitor side and the press box before the 2024 football season. And once we get some price points and get started on the projects, we'll be able to determine what part of phase 3 and 4 we'll be able to do with the remaining funds.
Did you say the visitor side, or
Yes.
did you say the home side?
Visitor side will be done first. That will be done during the spring, summer of this year. Yes, ma'am. So we'll be able to use that seating for any playoffs that we might have for the 2023-2024 sports season. And it still allows the other sports teams to practice during the summer and it won't interfere with their schedules.
All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. Mr. Satterfield.
You knew I was going to ask a question. All right, the the restrooms by the baseball field, when are they to
Yes,
be
sir.
completed?
They're part of Phase 3. You talking about the ones up on the hill, the locker rooms?
No, I'm talking about, well, they use them for visitors' locker rooms for football, but they're also the restrooms for baseball and track. So they will not be used. Will they be part of the spring of this coming year?
Yes, sir. As far as renovations or
As
usage?
far as renovations, will they be part of the project for this spring?
No, sir.
Okay, so because, spring sports, and there's not a lot of space.
Yes, sir.
And that's another thing, there's not a lot of space between the visitor stands and the baseball field.
Right, sir.
So you're going to really be pressed right there. But I just wanted to make sure that those restroom facilities, because there's nothing else close.
No, sir. They'll remain in place and operational during that process.
Okay.
Do we have any other questions? I do have a couple questions. Do we have anything else that may, because this is kind of changing the scope of what we initially projected to happen,
Yes,
right?
ma'am.
I mean, now we're concentrating on the visitor side and not the home side, and I would think that a lot of the Chapin folks would think that the home side would take priority. So I want to make sure that we don't run out of money and we have a really great visitor side section, and then we're not able to complete the press box in the home side. That's one of my concerns. And another concern is, are there other issues that could potentially be roadblocks that we're not anticipating financially, like parking or, the original scope of what the press box may look like?
Well, I can assure you this, we're not going to spend $7 million on visitor seating. I guarantee you that we're going to complete the visitors stadium or seating first and have enough to do the press box. That's our goal. That's why we're working within that 7.5 million. There might be a point in time that we have to come back and address the reality that this might cost more than what we originally agreed on. A lot of it has to do, of course, with the pricing. I'm sure you saw what was in Lexington one, where they started a project at 35 and now it's 19 million additional. I'm not going to get to that point. What we're trying to do, working with the architect and engineer and the engineers, is to make sure that when we do sewers and we do power lines and we do other things, that it's in preparation for phase 3 and 4. We do not want to lose sight of that. We just got to make sure that we have the right funding, that we stay within the procurement guidelines and the contract that was originally discussed October 2021.
That we stay within phase 3 and phase 4, but really the priority would be phase 1 and phase 2,
Phase
right?
1 and phase 2. And again, this is just talking to Michael Ames. It allows them to draw in the revenue for the football season. As you know, that supports the other sports programs in Chapin area. So it's a big interest in making sure that he's able to maintain that funding.
I would like to say, Madam Chair, for the record, though, we can say with a high degree of certainty that phase 1 and phase 2 can be completed
Yes, sir.
under budget.
Yes, sir.
That's what I
That's it.
need. That's what I would like to hear. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Does anybody else have any other questions? Ms. Huddle, I don't see Ms. All right. Ms. Huddle, I see you now. Ms. Huddle?
Yes, there may be an issue with the amount of money available to complete all 4 phases, correct?
Correct. We do see when that original estimate came back that phase 3 and 4, those are at jeopardy of not being able to be completed. For us to meet our objectives that the board established, we needed to get to a 5A stadium. The condition of the away side became the number 1 issue. So that's phase 1. Then the number 2 issue was addressing the concessions in the press box. So we feel that we can knock those out. Inflation has taken away other parts of it, but we have still delivered what we told the public, that was a 5A stadium rehab.
Any more questions, Ms. Huddle? Okay. Anybody else? All right. We appreciate it, Mr. Wiseman.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. All right, so that moves us to item 17 on our discussion agenda, fiscal year 2022 audit. Ross?
All right. At this time, I'm going to ask Ms. Madison Paul to come forward and walk us through our annual fiscal audit. And I know we have a guest that will be presenting as well.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Ross, Madam Chair, members of the board. I will invite Ms. Jaramillo up in just a minute, but I did want to thank the members of my staff that are here today that I was not aware of they were going to be here. But they are the finance staff, and they have done a wonderful job working with our auditor, getting all the documentation that she's asked for, taking her recommendations, answering any questions, things like that. So I do just want to appreciate my staff for their hard work, and even the ones that are not here. So wanted to get that out there before I invite Ms. Jaramillo up. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, good evening again, Madam Chair, members of the board, and Superintendent. So before us this evening, we have a brief PowerPoint to go through on the results of the 6/30/2022 audit. And then you should each have the printed version of the audited financial statements. And so we can go through some of that. And I also do have the management letter recommendations that were provided in letter format to the board, and you all can let me know how much you would like me to present on those when the time comes. But with that, I guess I'll go ahead and start if that's okay. So again, we're going over the results backwards in time of your regular external audit that you have once a year for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2022. And the purpose of this communication really for the auditor and the any district or local government or governmental entity being audited is to ensure that there's two-way communication between the board members and the auditors, and also administration as well, and to periodically discuss the status and any issues that may arise during the course of the audit. So we have a slide on the auditor's responsibilities, and again, differentiating this external audit, what I call sometimes a regular audit that you go through each year. We do take a look at your internal controls, but not for the purpose of expressing an opinion on the effectiveness of the entity's internal controls. We are responsible for communicating significant matters related to the financial statement audit and internal controls that we believe are relevant to the responsibilities of those charged with governance, meaning you all. So you have oversight of course, of the entire district. Part of our responsibilities includes providing you with an auditor's opinion, and that's really what you pay us for, is the letters that you'll see here in the report that have JAG letterhead on them. And one of them is an opinion on the financial statements, another on the federal programs that we tested, and another just a report on internal control. Next, we have several slides here that I'm not going to go into, but I just wanted them for management and the board's review, and just a reminder that our audit does not relieve management of their responsibilities in any way. External audits, most of the time, only identify fraud, for example, 3% of the time. So a regular external audit is not really meant to go down into that level. We just take a look at material things, and we do sampling and take a risk-based approach. But even with all of that, management has many, many responsibilities that they have to ensure that the books and records are in good order, of course, and provide everything to us. They sign a representation letter, which I believe you also have a copy of, just informing us about anything that happened during the year, etc. So the components of the district's audit includes the financial statement audit, and then also the what we call UGG, or Uniform Grant Guidance Federal, what used to be called a single audit. This just goes over a little bit about the planned scope of the audit and what we cover. And we do take, as I mentioned, a risk-based approach and do sampling. We take all of the standard changes for the year. Governmental accounting standards boards, they come out with new things all the time. I think we're past 100 now, so we're probably at GASB 101 or something. But the one GASB that was implemented this year that was not material to the district was on leases. And so the timing of the audit, this just goes through the time frame during the course of the year. When we had the procurement was completed, engagement letters signed, when we did planning, did the federal testing, and all the way down to the financial statements. From here, as far as timing, the audit has been released and will go to the GFOA for an award that the district applies for and receives every year. So that is a great award and adds for the community another layer of transparency in the report. So there's a lot of statistical information that not every district does do, but I think it's great to have that extra award and transparency that you have. So here again are just listing out the auditor's opinions and reports that you pay us for. You do have a clean opinion or unmodified opinion, which is the highest level of assurance that you can receive from an auditor on your FY22 audit. And again, that's just saying that your financial statements are materially stated accurately. And in the prior years, there were no findings, so there were none to clear or repeat per se. But in the current year, we did have a general finding regarding the procurement and contracts of issues that existed as far as any material weaknesses or control deficiencies within the fiscal year under audit. Because of timing, the district just hadn't yet been able to, with everything being identified, correct them entirely during fiscal year 22. So some still remained. So there is a general finding that just refers back to the other detailed reports for that. This is just post-audit required communication that we're not aware of any uncorrected misstatements or disagreements with management. Of course, consultation with other accountants or what's called opinion chopping, that didn't occur. And any significant issues were mostly just related to the procurement work, but didn't impact the fiscal year 22 audit itself. We are independent, and then your policies and procedures, of course, are aligned with the industry, and so pretty typical for what we see in other districts. And so at this point, I can pause as like kind of an overall, if you have any questions or comments, and take questions to this point before we jump into the report.
Do we have any questions to this point? All right, I'm going to just ask a question just because you literally I had written a question to ask, and you have pretty much answered it in what you said, that we do have a clean audit, and that in your management letter you did find some material weaknesses. And I just wanted to ask, just for fiscal year 22, did you find any specific instances of fraud or misuse or noncompliance in fiscal year 2022?
I would say that there was some noncompliance with procurement as it relates to some of the vendors, not all though, and also as a combination of controlled deficiencies that leads up to a material weakness. We just have the one finding, but as far as fraud, no, we did not.
And those are line itemed in this report of what those specific instances of noncompliance.
Right.
Okay.
So we refer.
And this will be public on our website, right?
Right.
Okay.
We refer to the other reports for any allegations or possibilities or risks of fraud. In this report itself, we just make a kind of general statement that there were some weaknesses, and to refer to the other report.
For the
So,
possibilities.
but we didn't
Okay.
note anything new, I guess, is what I'm saying, with the fiscal year 22 regular audit. So, and I really do want to thank the team. Dr. Ross has been amazing to work with, and as well, Madison, you've been great. Thank you. She's always willing to listen and ask questions and keep things on track, and even working hard on the GASBs, for example, which is impressive. And then also Leanne, thank you, and Connie too. County's always there for us, and Leanne, bright as can be, and always getting us what we need and answering our emails. And Dr. Turner, I did want to thank you as well. I know, hopefully I'm not leaving anybody out, but you know, they just really have been great to work with through the external audit process. So, okay, jumping to the printed packet, and I do believe this is online as well. Amy, did you say the audit is online for any members of the public that may want to see it? And members of the board, if you would like to stop me at any time as we go through this, feel free to do that so that I can answer any questions for you. And then the suggestion that I had is, if you have more detailed questions, I'm happy to answer them. You had the great idea, Madam Chair, of a workshop if you all wanted in January. These reports can be very detailed and complex, and school district finances, very, very complicated. So the more that you're kind of exposed to it as new board members and getting that layering in of education on it, the more and more that you will understand from the financial perspective for your oversight role. But this is a very heavy report. There's a lot in there, and for the public too, there's a lot to refer to. So starting on the table of contents, let's just take like an overview of this. And the introductory section, these, in this section here, it just lists, the roster, the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting, which is the GFOA award that I referred to, and letter of transmittal, which comes from management. And after the introductory section of this report, which is called a CAFR or ACFR, the Annual Comprehensive Financial Report, it jumps into the financial section. And so you'll see in the table of contents here, we have the auditor's report, the MD&A, we call it the Management's Discussion and Analysis, starts on page 4. That is going to be a good comparison from your prior year to current year numbers. So looking at the district overall, and there's some discussion by management as to what has changed for capital assets, long-term debt, etc. For the basic financial statements, those start on page 11 and continue on to page 12. And those would be what I would call an overall district balance sheet and income statement. And so in the for-profit world, they would be called balance sheet and income statement. For us, they're called statement of net position and statement of activities. And that's district-wide overall, and includes your debt and your capital assets, for example. Next, it jumps into the fund financial statements. And Madison, I don't know if you know offhand how many funds you all have, or Leanne. It's got to be probably, 40, maybe 50 at least. So to you all who are familiar with just one business's set of books, imagine multiplying that times 50 or 60, however many funds are here. And so it is very, very complex. And there's balance sheets and statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balance, which is like an income statement. And then we have the proprietary fund, which is kind of like a business fund, but it's an after-school program that the district has set up that way as an enterprise or proprietary fund type. And then notes to the financial statements start on page 22. The RSI, required supplementary information, this is all going to be a lot of detail on the district's net pension liability and OPEB liability. And some of you may be familiar with several years ago, the GASB decided that as a disclosure item, any retirement plans, such as pensions and like retiree health care and such, need the unfunded portions by your state plans. The unfunded portion gets pushed down according to your employees, the number of them, your cost pro rata share onto your books. So let's say that the state has $1 billion that's not funded. All of the districts in the entire state have to get their share of that unfunded $1 billion. And so that is a huge liability onto your books. It doesn't come out as cash, but it is a disclosure item that the GASB requires. Okay, OSI. There's, and this is where I think for some of you that are new to the district, there's going to be all of these descriptions, the general fund description, the special revenue fund descriptions of what they are, what these funds are, what they do. So those are on page 61, 72, debt service fund description on page 90, capital projects funds are on page 92, and enterprise funds on 95. Then there's a couple of state Department of Ed schedules that are required, and then you jump into the statistical section, which is another level of transparency for your public, and part of the GFOA award. The last piece here of the table of contents is going to be the compliance section, starting with our report on internal controls, and then our opinion for the federal program that was tested on page 131, and then your CFA, what's called a CFA, or Schedule of Expenditures of Federal Awards, on page 134, and the notes to those, and then any schedule of prior audit findings, which we saw earlier, there were none, and then schedule of findings and question costs for the current year. And then at the very end is a corrective action plan for any findings in the current year, for the current year. So, with all of that being said, that's the basic overall structure of the financial statements and how they're laid out. They go from, kind of very general statements, government-wide, to very detailed in the back. So if you all want to turn to page 11, we'll take a quick look at the overall district statement and net position or balance sheet. So on page 11, we show that this snapshot of the balance sheet as of June 30, 2022 is, you have 12 million in cash, for example, 65 million in investments, and so on. And so just wanted to point out here that this is where you can see right as of June 30, all of the balances, and of course your equity or net position as well. You can see probably 3/4 of the way down your net pension liability for 240 million, and your share of the unfunded OPEB liability is 290 million. Bonds payable are on here as well. So on page 12 is the statement of activities for the district overall. And it's a little strange because it starts with expenses on the left and then goes into your program revenues, and general tax revenues are down here to the bottom of the schedule on page 12. So, for example, your property taxes for general purposes are about 73 million, and for debt service, 40 million, and that's for the whole year. And so that's how much you had in taxes, and then you had some PILT money as well, and some investment earnings, etc. So after that, it just jumps into the individual funds by group, so special projects, the major funds, debt service, capital projects, etc. And there's any level of detail that you all would like. It's good bedtime reading material, I think, if you want to fall asleep. But there's a lot of details here that we don't need to jump into tonight. But if you have questions, feel free to ask at any time. So starting in the footnotes, the way I describe the footnotes to people is kind of it tells the story and the policies of the numbers of the district. So if you were curious about, let's say, capital assets, you could go to page 32, and you could see the land that the district has. You could see the buildings, the furniture and equipment, how much was maybe sold or auctioned off and deleted, how much was added during the fiscal year and depreciated. The pensions, they go on ad nauseum for pages and pages with a lot of detail on pensions. Let's see if there's anything else I wanted to point out to you all. As far as long-term debt, page 49 does show, I know sometimes community members ask, well, how much is our district in debt? And so you'll be able to see that on page 49 as far as a summary and a roll forward. Again, it shows last year's balances plus, whatever we added for this year and then paid off during the year to give you your ending balance of how much debt the district has as of June 30. There were some tax abatements on page 55 that are disclosed. So anytime your counties or munis end up doing an IRB or an abatement agreement for taxes, that does impact the district, and I know it's to help economic development and bring jobs and everything, but as well it does impact the district, so that's required to be disclosed by GASB 77 there. So you forewent 1 or 2 million there in taxes because of those agreements made by the local governments. Okay, and then we can jump back to the CFA, which is on page 134. And I just wanted to point this one out because this shows the board members and the community all of your federal funds. And so this is all of the grants that were had expenditures during the fiscal year. And it categorizes it by U.S. Department of Ed, Ag, DOD, et cetera. So the district expended for fiscal year 22, $28.5 million in federal expenditures. And then if we had just 30 seconds, and maybe you'll ask me to just go to this page next year, but on page 138, to go over the audit, this is a very high-level summary of the audit. So unmodified opinions, no significant deficiencies. We did have a material weakness, but not on the federal programs. And then the federal grants that were tested were the Education Stabilization Fund, Title I, and Special Education Cluster. And lastly, on page 139 is the one finding that just refers to the other reports related to procurement, and also reiterates our recommendation that the district create an audit committee and internal auditor function. So on the financials, any questions or comments on the financial statements themselves?
Do we have any questions? No. Ms. Huddle, do you have any questions? Mr. Scully?
Yes, I have a few questions on the audit in general. Is this a time to discuss that? Yeah. Okay.
You can ask about this audit.
In your investigation or your practice for auditing and reviewing information, would handling or mishandling of confidential information be regularity or any type?
In what sense? That the district mishandled it?
Yeah, like if you found or if you became aware of instances of mishandling of private information or confidential information, would that be something that you as an auditor would notate or identify as a finding?
If it's something that was brought to our attention as a risk area that was of concern, then definitely that's something that we would take a look at with the district and determine, what occurred, what the concern was, and try to find an answer.
Okay. And same thing I would imagine about, let's say, duties and other parts of activities within the district is in the emails that were published, there was a certain chain that talked about or discussed the use of thumb drives for conveying information to you from the district, and that several people were copied, or there were several instances of thumb drives being sent to you, your firm, and other board members, and perhaps even other people in the district administration, as a way or a means to convey information, financial information. Actually, that's one of my questions is, one, thumb drives are not protected. They're not secure as a means of transferring information, certainly in consideration or relative to a government entity. So to me, there's a very large concern as far as why we transferred information to you on a thumb drive when there are, and who received the information, what information was on the thumb drive, and where are they now? Is that anything that you considered or looked at in your performance of the audit?
Point of order. Ms. Hines, is this on the agenda?
I'm sorry?
Well, I believe he's referencing this because it's discussed in the audit that was provided by Ms. Jamarillo, which is why I'm kind of waiting for him to what the question is.
Okay,
Well, my question is,
point
was
out-
that something that was identified in your review of the audit? And I know that you were aware of it because you were copied on the emails and acknowledged receiving it and so forth. So was that identified
So
as
is your question, is the information related to information and emails that were requested by FOIA referenced in this report?
No, my
And were
question
some
is-
of them the documents that were provided to her on a thumb drive?
Yeah, the practice of doing that, was that identified as a weakness?
Oh, is the practice of providing information on a thumb drive identified as a weakness in this annual external report? Is that your
Correct.
question? Okay, I'm just trying to make sure that it is relevant to the conversation at hand.
Okay. I think part of your concern is that JAG received information on a thumb drive. And I would say that, yes, we do receive information for audits on a number of sources, sometimes on our secure portal, sometimes on our engagement organizer, sometimes on a thumb drive, sometimes, just in whatever format. If we're on site, then we're able to take copies or just look at things on site. And so that's not a weakness that I have identified. If there's a specific concern, though, like I said earlier, definitely bring it to my attention, and that's something that we can take a look at. If there was a breach of confidentiality or a breach of something that you're concerned about, then you can let me know, and we'll
Well,
take
my
a look.
concern is just overall, to me, it's a breach of, if that information is not exposed, that's a weakness of and that should be a finding to where we should have some type of internal control. Your goal as well is to finding that and recommending some type of internal control. We don't expose ourselves to that type of liability or
Related to I think every time you hit the desk, the microphone cuts out. But you're asking about whether or not that breach is related to the financial information that was provided in this report?
right.
Okay. And Ms., did she answer the question to your,
She answered it.
okay,
Okay.
all right.
Yeah, I'm just not aware of a breach, but definitely maybe you can fill me in offline.
Yeah, I'll be happy to. And I guess
Ms. Barnhart, did you have a question?
No, that's fine.
Okay,
Go ahead.
okay. Ms. Huddle?
I would just like to go on the record that this was not on the agenda, and I don't think that discussion was appropriate. And we have at least one board member asking questions about an audit where he took contributions from one of the vendors in the audit. This is just totally inappropriate.
I don't
Noted.
agree because it's,
We're going to stay on task. Does anybody else have any question relating to the financial external audit? Hearing none.
Okay.
All right, Ms. Jamarillo, do you have anything else?
Yes,
to
just
present?
one more area, and I will be out of the way here. Just our management letter recommendations. I just wanted to make sure the board had seen those. They have items in here such as the warehouse, intangible assets, which addresses the sewer tap question, disaster recovery plan backups and penetration testing, things that as we were going through the external audit, we were able to make recommendations. Grants management, for example, we felt like it would be great to have an extra position just to oversee all of the grants and the reporting. So that was a recommendation that we had. There were some purchase orders, very minor, but some purchase orders that were dated after the commitments were made to purchase things, and so we call those after the fact purchase orders. So we have a recommendation on that. Bonds, for example, we're recommending to the board to take a look at the mill levy that may or may not be necessary at the level that it's at, and some additional information there, and taking a look at the lease with the Chamber of Commerce and getting a legal opinion on that and bringing it to the board. So there's just some additional comments that we had here that were not material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, but just operationally ways of things that you can take a look at and strengthen your controls and compliance with those particular areas. Just suggestions really to look at that we noted through our work.
All right, do we have any final questions for Ms. Jamarillo? All right.
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you so much for everything that you've done throughout this whole process. I know it's probably been very arduous and difficult, but we do appreciate everything you've done. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
All right, have a
Thank
good
you.
evening.
All right, so that moves us to the final item on the discussion agenda, which is the discussion and first reading on proposed revisions to board policy DIE, fiscal accounting and audits, Exhibit N.
Madam Chair, thank you. We would, in an effort to increase our controls and compliance, we bring to you an update on fiscal accounting and audits. I'm going to ask our CFO, Madison Pohl, to come forward and walk us through this process.
Thank you. Tonight I'm bringing to you for the second time item or board policy DIE on fiscal accounting and audits. So a little background on this policy change. The Policy Committee met on November 2nd to review this policy. We had discussed after in that session to add some language about internal controls. We had a proposed revision to those internal controls that came directly from Fort Mill School District's policy. So their policy DIE actually just focuses on internal controls, and it's a few pages long, but in that committee meeting, the recommendation was to pull just one paragraph from Fort Mill School District's policy to add to our current DIE, fiscal accounting and audits policy, just to talk directly about internal controls. This change states as follows: the Board of Trustees is responsible for setting the expectations for internal control, ensuring administration is aware of those expectations, requiring the upward communication channels are open through all levels of management, and evaluating management's effectiveness towards monitoring the control environment and implementing sound internal controls. This is all the change, the only change that is recommended at this time, but I would be glad to take any questions.
I'm going to ask a question. I believe when we had our board officers meeting and we were talking about this coming back on the agenda, because even though it was brought, we haven't done the first reading yet. This is the first reading and discussion for this item. It was mentioned, I believe, Dr. Ross, that this policy was referencing Fort Mills policy, but also that and I'm not sure, because now that I've seen the paragraph, if it is just adding this one paragraph, or if the Fort Mill policy actually talks about the reporting aspect of who the internal auditor reports to, like reporting to the entire board instead of like a subcommittee. And so I want to know if that is what the administration's interpretation of this is. If we implement this policy, does it take away the need for a specific audit committee, or does the Fort Mill policy as written in Fort Mill, where the entire policy, because I'll be honest, I have not looked at that yet, and I just realized that as we were looking at this. Does that address an internal audit committee?
No, so I think there's a little bit of confusion. So
Okay.
when I presented last time, these were two separate policies. So the first policy
Right.
was talking about an audit committee, establishing that. This
Right.
is the second policy that did not relate to the first. So this does not, adding in this language does
That's what
not
I thought
discuss an
originally.
no, it does not discuss an internal
Does the
auditor at all.
Fort Mill policy address an internal audit
It does
committee?
not.
It does not.
Fort Mill does not have an internal auditor.
Okay.
The
That's
correct
what I wanted
policy
to
to
know.
address an audit committee is actually in Board Policy B, because that is something that the board would do. So D is for fiscal accounting. But Board Policy B, and I pulled Richland 1, their board policy on internal auditing and the role. But that's not what is here.
Okay.
This is just specific to internal controls
That's what
and,
I thought
and
originally,
the
so
board
that makes sense.
responsibility.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? Mr. Satterfield?
Yeah, I think Mr. Ross's green light was on before
No.
me, so I'll let him go.
I yield to the board, but I would say that what this does allow us to do is we can develop an R policy related to this for the internal auditor, correct?
I don't think that is the section that an internal auditor would go into, because it is the internal auditor reports to the board or audit committee. So in every policy that I've found where there is internal auditor mentioned, it's all in that Board Policy B leading into something else. It is not actually in the fiscal accounting section.
Okay. That's why we had put this on the agenda, because we thought that we needed to have this to approve the budget. When you bring it to us, and we needed to have something approved before we approve an internal auditor on our budget in January.
I mean, we can certainly look at implementing this other, policy that Richland 1 has, but this is not what
Okay.
this specific DIE addresses.
Mr. Satterfield?
Yeah, my question, I'm going to put my principal's hat back on. The way this is written, I see how it was just interjected into the policy. And I'm sure in the rest of their policy reads differently than ours. But it says the Board of Trustees is responsible for setting the expectations. Are these written expectations? I mean, how are you going to measure this? We're supposed to have these controls, and there's a management and evaluation tool. Can you tell me how that will be done? I mean, everything else in this policy reads, Mr. Ross or Dr. Ross is responsible for everything else. But it says the board is responsible for setting these expectations, ensuring administration is aware. I don't know what those, do we have a copy of those expectations? Requiring that channels are open and through all levels of management, and evaluating. We're responsible for evaluating management's effectiveness towards monitoring. Did they have an evaluation tool? I'm just trying to, I like it. I mean, I'm not saying I don't like it. I do like it. I was just curious as to how we can apply it.
Correct. So I think the basis for this is a tone at the top. You know, that's something that has been recommended to us from our external auditors that you know, internal controls does start at the top. So as the Board of Trustees, there has to be an expectation set that we will have internal controls within the district. Now, I do not believe that this section says the board of trustees will establish what these are, just that there will be internal controls, because I believe we as an administration establish those controls. But there are definitely tone at the top controls that need to be in place.
But that's not what it says, though. If it said the Board of Trustees has the expectations that there will be internal controls and requiring upward communications. And, you know, that's one of the things you talked about before about this handbook, I guess. Was it a handbook that they had at Fort Mill?
Yes,
I think that's a great idea, too, by the way. So that would sort of fit in with that. And maybe it's just semantics, just the way it's reading. But I was just, again, I'm used to writing goals. And then when you write goals, they're measurable. And there are certain things that you write in those goals that you have to measure to make sure that you hit your outcomes. And so if it said the Board of Trustees expects or has expectations that there will be internal controls and da-da-da-da, it would, and maybe semantics, but I just wanted to voice that, okay?
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Ms. Huddle's had her hand up. I'm going to call on Ms. Huddle.
I think Mr. Satterfield has a really good point, and I think that it lies in the fact that this was one paragraph excerpted from Fort Mill's policy. And we had talked, and this was, you know, a couple months ago in the policy committee, and Dr. Ross, maybe you could address this, but we talked about having a DIER policy that would get into some of those processes and procedures like other R policies do.
That's correct. We're discussing that, the notion of the R, but Ms. Pohl says in terms of the actual listed out controls of the internal auditor, you've seen cases where that belongs in B policy.
Yes, that's where I'm seeing it. I mean, we can certainly look to add an R that would give more defined guidelines of what those internal controls would be and the expectations. An internal auditor could be listed in there, but I also believe that just the internal auditing function needs to be in policy section B as well.
Do you have the Richland 1 policy in front of you?
I
Do you
do.
know when that was last modified?
It was adopted in 2000 and revised in March of 21.
Mr. Scully, did you have any questions?
Yeah, my concern about this is, do we know when, or if we're relying on policies instituted from other districts, we're not privy to any of the conversations or any of the diligence that went into those districts implementing those policies or writing those policies. We don't know what the liability issues could be created as a result of their policies. And so I'm not comfortable with it just taking policies from other districts just because they have them. Even Fort Mill, who academically is exceptional, but we don't know whether this policy would stand up to legal test. And I think it would be bad and kind of reckless on our behalf to adopt a policy that hasn't been reviewed, for example, by the South Carolina School Board Association for our own benefit, for our purposes, just to make sure that if we proceed with it, then we can do so with confidence, not just because we took a policy from another district. And so I would not be in favor of adopting any policies until we have the chance to have them reviewed on our behalf by an authoritative source.
We can do that. I mean, I will say most of the policies that you'll find online, I mean, they're laid out the same way. And so you can pretty much go to any district and their policies are almost verbatim the same. This is unique to Fort Mill. So this change, this internal audit or internal control policy is unique to Fort Mill.
And I think last time, correct me if I'm mistaken, last time you mentioned that there are not very many school districts right now that have an internal auditor or that have committees related to an internal audit because they don't have an internal auditor.
Correct.
So I'm assuming that because of that, the School Board Association does not have like a recommended policy for that. And I wonder if, I think an internal auditor is a good idea, and I definitely, I just want to make sure that, you know, we're not doing, by asking questions or making sure that we get it right, because, you know, I've always said that, you know, a policy is like the Constitution, like you should not change it all of the time. So when we implement whatever policy that we're going to implement, we need to make sure that we have it right. And we're kind of talking about a novel idea. And I think an internal auditor is a great idea. I think that if anything has come out of all of the audits that have been going on, that those internal checks and balances and controls are important. But my question relating to this policy or any other policy regarding the fact that I believe you're going to bring us a budget in January that we're going to have to approve and all of that, and we'll need to put out you know, a job description for an internal auditor and their responsibilities. Can that be done without a policy in place in January?
I would have to defer to legal on that one.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
I don't
The
believe
board
he's
is
here.
Still here.
Yes, okay, I'm just curious. I think that it
Yeah.
can, I think we can, the process can be started, especially if this policy does not relate to it. I was just curious as to how that went. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions relating to this? All right, is there a motion about this policy? Or, yep. Do we need a motion for first reading, I believe? Yep, it'll advance it to second. So if there's a motion, I'll hear it. If not, then,
Thank you.
I think we have a motion. We have a motion?
I'd like to make a motion that we approve the first reading, discussion, and first reading of proposed revisions to board policy BI/BIE, fiscal accounting/audits, and exhibit N.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Ms. Barnhart? Do we have any more discussions about this?
Yeah, I have a discussion.
Okay.
Since
looked
I'm
right at you 'cause I
a
figured as much.
rookie, if we approve, if I vote for this motion, does that mean that the wording will not be changed? Or do I have to go with the wording as it is?
I believe that you can make suggestions you can make a motion to
To
amend the
amend
wording.
it somewhat?
Yeah, you can make a motion to amend the
Okay.
wording. You can also do that before the second reading where we can see different
Okay.
options.
Okay,
You can
thank you.
submit different options.
No,
Yep.
thank you.
All right, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? All, that is 6. All opposed? That's 1. 6-1. The motion passes. All right, that brings us to item 19 on the agenda. Ms. Snipes?
I make a motion that we adjourn.
Have a second? Mr. Hogan? All in favor? All right. Do we have all in favor? Okay, Ms. Huddle? All right, that's 7-0. All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you. Merry Christmas. Yep, Happy New Year.